does whatever he wants, whenever he wants to do it, although he occasionally listens to the things that I say. Things like Domino, get off the top of the wardrobe rarely get any attention at all. But Domino, here's a treat for you, might get his notice eventually. On the other hand, he's fairly confident that, like E.F. Hutton, when he speaks, I will pay attention. Of course, E.F. Hutton only had something to say if you had money to invest. Dom speaks if he's hungry or bored or thinks I should open the door so he can look at the hummingbirds, or he wants to play or has decided that I've slept long enough. He can be very loud and insistent when trying to get my attention. Sometimes, recently, he chooses to allow me to be rewarded for my faithful attention to his desires by letting me scratch his ears. That just started a few days ago. I'm quite excited about it. It may not come as a surprise to you that at least one general minister and president of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ referred to his job as herding cats. We're congregational, bound together by covenant, but not by any hierarchy or rigid set of rules on how we're supposed to be in relationship together. We can choose whether or not to adhere to any resolution passed by our General Assembly, and we can give or not give to the special offerings that are designated to support the church as a whole. Unlike other denominations, each disciples' congregation may choose how much or how little it wishes to participate in the life of the larger church. However, we all expect to be heard when we have something to say. We are indeed a lot like cats in that regard. The church in Rome was an extremely diverse and challenging group of cats. And it was Paul's job to try to bring them and keep them together. Like the church everywhere at the time, it consisted of small house churches, not one big congregation. And those congregations consisted of both lifelong devout Jews like Priscilla and Aquila, and people who had previously worshipped all kinds of gods from all over the Roman Empire. People who knew nothing of the law and the prophets, but had heard stories about Jesus. They were learning about Abraham and Moses and all the rest, but they really didn't understand why all those silly laws ought to apply to them. They weren't Jews, they were Christ followers. Many of the Jewish Christians, on the other hand, felt that before one could be a follower of Christ, one had to first be fully a Jew, including circumcision if you were male and adherence to all of the laws and dietary requirements. This was a fairly constant battle, raging from Jerusalem outwards into the known world. It's a topic that Peter addressed a few times, memorably at the baptism of Cornelius and his household. And it was a topic that Paul was constantly coming back to, especially with the church in Rome. As the subject of blind obedience to the law was one of the things that Jesus addressed fairly often, it must have been really frustrating for Paul and the other evangelists to have to come back to the same topic over and over again. Abraham was certainly the perfect example of what it meant to live faithfully in the absence of a rigid code of conduct. God came to him in Mesopotamia, a rich and fertile land, and said, "Pack up everything and head off for the unknown because I say so." And Abraham did. And God said, "You'll have a son with your wife, even though both of you are way too old." And Abraham believed. And later, God said, "Take your only child and sacrifice his life to me." And Abraham was willing to do just that. Abraham was faithful. Yes, he had a couple of moments of doubt, but God always assured him that the promise, their covenant, would come to fruition. There were no 10 commandments handed to Abraham. Isaac and Jacob and Joseph had no formal code of law to follow. They simply went forward faithfully with the power that believing in the promises that God had made to them. Now, to be fair, they were one family, a very large family, but a family nonetheless. There was one head of the family with the power of life and death over all of the rest of them, which the rest of us cannot claim, although sometimes there have been moments, I think, in many parents' lives when one of my favorite Bill Cosby quotes was, "I brought you into this life, I can take you out." Had something to do with a $90 shirt, I believe. There was no question in this large family that elderly parents and widows and fatherless children were going to be taken care of. They didn't need laws to legislate how to take care of a widowed auntie and her young son. These were family, and you take care of family. We will conveniently ignore for the moment that embarrassing bit about Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, as apparently that had to happen in order for the family to be saved later in the famine to come. God had not required that this family provide a temple or even a tent, or demanded any particular sort of worship. God was the family's own personal God, who went with them and watched over them in every circumstance and situation, and the family did what God told them to do, went where God told them to go, and reaped the benefit of the covenant that God had made with their father Abraham. Later, after 400 years in Egypt, the Hebrews were many thousands strong. They were no longer just one large family. They were a people. 12 tribes who hadn't been in touch with God much at all and didn't really know about the covenant that Abraham had made with God. They'd spent the last 400 years exposed to formal, ritualized worship in a land with a rigid code of conduct that set expectations and duties for everyone according to their class and their occupation and their ranking. They didn't understand simply faithfully following God. They needed a formal priesthood and ritual because it was really all they knew or understood. It's all they'd ever experienced. They no longer felt like one family, so take care of the family was not a viable construction. They needed that structure of laws and codes of conduct. Now, side note, because history is fun, it has been noted by many, many scholars that the law of Moses is almost identical in many ways to the Code of Hammurabi, which was the law of Mesopotamia when Abraham lived there. But in addition to the how to get along as a society laws, like those in the Code of Hammurabi, the Mosaic laws included rules that would separate them from all other people. Laws about diet and circumcision, for example, as well as laws prohibiting intermarriage with non-believers. From that time to this, the laws of Moses have allowed the Jewish people to be a people, separate and distinct in their practices from all others. So, 1,500 years from the time of Moses, in first century Rome, Paul's busy trying to convince the Jewish Christians that all of them, Jew and Gentile alike, are children of Abraham, some through descent in the law and some through faith. All God required of Abraham was faith, and that is all God requires of these new followers, these Christ followers. The church was rapidly becoming something other than merely another Jewish sect, which is the way Rome saw it for quite some time. It was becoming something that was both more and, in some ways, seemingly less than the religion in which Paul and the other Jewish Christians had been raised. He was almost echoing the words of Peter at the baptism of Cornelius. If God's Holy Spirit accepts these, even though they haven't been circumcised and they don't live under the law that guides our lives, who are we to tell them no? One of the greatest laws in human nature is our desire to control everything. We love making rules that will protect us from ourselves. We love setting up codes of conduct for everybody, even if those codes might cause more harm than good. No child left behind. And once we have a law in the books, it's almost impossible to dislodge it. I mean, they're still spitting on the sidewalk laws in Philadelphia and other places. So we have Christians who will kick you out of church for dancing in your living room and want to decide who God will and will not allow to be part of their congregation. And we have folks who claim that Jesus is the only way but want to govern the United States using the laws in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. We have Christians who want to tell you whether or not you're really a Christian because you do or don't follow a particular set of beliefs and practices that they follow. This is not a new conversation. Peter and Paul and all the others were trying to counter that same argument 2,000 years ago. Jesus said, the greatest law is this, that you love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength. And the second greatest is like it, that you love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets hinge on these two laws, he said. Paul reminds us that Abraham lived pre-law. That Abraham is the father of all of us because Abraham was faithful to God, not because he was obedient to a set of rules. And that Abraham's faithfulness was rewarded in the founding of a great nation by descendants as numerous as grains of sand. Abraham's faithfulness was rewarded by God's faithfulness to his disciples down to today. Abraham's faithfulness was rewarded even by God's faithfulness to those descendants who ignored or denied or disobeyed or turned their backs on God. Abraham's faithfulness was rewarded by God's faithfulness in sending Jesus to teach us, to reach out to us, to bring us to God, to make a new covenant with a new people. The good news is, as Paul said, we are descendants of Abraham through faith. We are not held to the kind of laws our Jewish brothers and sisters continue to follow. We are, however, required to be faithful, to be obedient to the will of God, to follow those two great commandments that Jesus came to teach us, to live out the Great Commission. We are required always and forever to serve the one who has always been faithful to us, and to raise our voices in praise, proclaiming God's great faithfulness. Let us give praise to the Lord our God.